Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests from across the international community, we sincerely thank you for taking the time to be with us today for the launch of the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya's new report, which is dubbed The Quality of Secondhand Clothes Imported to Kenya and the Associated Environmental Impacts. My name is Eric Latif. I'm a journalist in Kenya. I host Kenya's biggest morning radio and TV show called The Situation Room. It airs on Spice FM and KTN. I'll be chairing this session today, and I'm joined by panelists. We've got Ms. Teresia Wairimo. She's the chairperson of the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya. We also have Leah Mango and Tobias Adiambo from Information Research Solution, the team that conducted the research that we are going to discuss. We also have Professor Patrick Diamond of Queen Mary University, London, who edited this report. It's a timely report that responds to the increased international media attention that the secondhand clothing industry is receiving in Kenya and elsewhere, particularly around waste. And we want to do this by improving the quality of available evidence. The report and today's session was organized by the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya to help them to tell their side of the story, one that reflects the members' lived experience, and hopefully that will begin a process whereby any discussion of policy decisions made for this industry will include the very traders who will be affected. So this session will be recorded and it will later be uploaded to the MCAK website, and it will be shared with all of you alongside a copy of the report. And just before we begin, I'd like to confirm that there will be a Q&A session following the presentations, and that you can submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens throughout the presentation. At the end of this, we'll be able to answer these questions. Please try and refrain from using the chat function for anything other than technical issues, such as if our internet drops or a speaker is too quiet. We'd like to start first by viewing a short video from the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya.
My name is Jane Muya, and today I want to talk about the Mitumba clothing industry. The Mitumba industry is not just clothing culture in Kenya, but it's also a source of income for numerous households. Many job seekers are drawn into urban centers with the promise of greater opportunities, and the Mitumba sector has for years served as an obvious entry point. It's an industry that is loved by many Kenyans, including me. To be honest, since I started buying clothes for myself, I rarely buy new clothes. I majorly depend on the second-hand clothes, and for good reasons. Number one, the Mitumba clothes are very cheap. They are affordable for many people. You cannot compare them with the cheap clothes, because with 1,000 bob, which can buy 5 Mitumba clothes, that is. Yeah, and it's affordable for many people. The government killing the Mitumba industry will be taking us to an era when people used to wear clothes that are torn and clothes full of patches, a problem that the Mitumba industry had already solved. Killing the Mitumba industry to revive the textile industry, there's no way that they'll be selling these locally manufactured clothes at 30 bob, 50 bob, the way we are used to buying the Mitumba clothes. Yeah, it will become difficult for many people, especially right now when the cost of living is very high. The other thing is that Mitumba clothes and shoes are long-lasting. So my biggest question to Kenyans today is, with this high cost of living, would you prefer a pair of clothes that will service you for 5 months or 1 month? Only if you can afford it, then be it. But sometimes it's good we look at those that cannot afford it. It's good to equalize ourselves.
Now let's hear some few remarks from Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya chairperson, Teresia Wairimo. Teresia, let's hear from you.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for the opportunity and for everybody who has availed themselves to be in this very, very important meeting today. The meeting is happening for the sake of about 2 million Kenyans who rely on used clothes as their source of income and as their source of livelihood. Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests from across the international community, We sincerely thank you for taking the time to be with us today for the launch of our new report, The Quality of Second-Hand Clothes Imported to Kenya and the Associated Environmental Impacts. I am Teresia Wairimu Jenga, Chair of the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya, and it's a privilege to be with you today to speak on behalf of the industry, to speak on behalf of the 2 million Kenyans who rely on Mitumba trade. As you may be aware, Kenya is one of the largest importers of second-hand clothes, also known as Mitumba in Swahili language, all over East Africa. The sector is crucial to Kenya's economy, where it employs over 2 million people and indirectly supports the livelihoods of over 20 million Kenyans. In the whole region of East African community, the second-hand clothes sector supports about 3.4 million green jobs and provides about $419 million in government revenues. Furthermore, second-hand clothes are vital to the economic and social future of the countries comprising the East Africa community. The sector makes a valuable contribution to driving the transition towards a circular, sustainable economy. Second-hand clothes increases the reuse rate for textile and ensure more material will be used for recycling. This report could not come at a better time. We hope that it will improve the quality of debate about our trade and address the inaccurate claims that have put millions of jobs and livelihoods at risk on the false altar of protecting the environment. Our report has found that not only does the sector contribute significantly to the economy of the country, but that it reduces overall textile waste while helping to cut carbon emissions and other environmental impacts on the textile sector. Rather than being a threat to the environment, second-hand clothes are a crucial pillar in global endeavors towards reuse, a circular economy, and sustainability in the textile sector. We are clear that the threat to our natural world is fast fashion and not the second-hand clothing sector. The report has found that our sector provides 2 million green jobs in Kenya, supports about 20 million livelihoods, and contributes over $400 million to the Kenya tax authorities in 2021 and 2022 alone. The report confirms that the vast majority of second-hand clothes imported into standards, supported by a robust sorting infrastructure, and that the quality control processing overseen by the government of Kenya ensures low levels of clothing waste and high level of compliance. This means that the proportion of waste generated by imported second-hand clothes into Kenya is estimated at less than 2%. Yes, less than 2%. Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya welcomes any improvement that can be made in this important sector. Unfortunately, inaccurate misinformation circulating in the Western media. Policy decisions affecting second-hand clothes should be based on robust evidence and involve listening to the industry and individuals whose livelihoods depend on this sector and will be most affected. I am grateful that we are joined today by our research team, Information Research Solutions, and the editor of our report, Professor Patrick Diamond of Queen Mary University of London, to present the methodology and the findings of the report. The Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya would like to work with the domestic and international stakeholders to address any concern about our sector, based on robust evidence in partnership with us, not to us. I thank you again for your attendance. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Teresia, for those remarks, highlighting the importance of this particular business to very many people, employing 2 million people directly and 20 million people indirectly. So this is not just a small industry, and the contribution that it has had to revenues in terms of government revenues also immense and cannot be ignored. We now have Professor Patrick Diamond from the Queen Mary University, London, who edited this report, and now he can give us the findings. Prof, over to you.
Thank you so much, and honoured guests, it's very good to be with you wherever you are in the world. So my role, as the chair said, is really just to summarise the findings of this report and also to place them in the broader context of the strategic position of the second-hand clothing trade in Kenya, looking specifically at its environmental and climate change impact. So moving on, and what I'm going to do in this presentation very briefly is just sketch the background to this report and then go into some detail on the research objectives around what this study was attempting to ascertain. And then going to very quickly summarise the key findings from the research. And given what the research tells us about the enormous contribution of the second-hand clothing trade to the economy and the environment in countries like Kenya, I'm going to discuss what policies could most advantageously support this industry in the future. And then I will very quickly draw the presentation to a close with some concluding comments. So, just to give you the sense of the context and the scale of this industry, it is fair to say that the second-hand clothing trade has become a very significant industry, not just in Kenya, not just in East Africa, but also globally. The scale of the international trade in second-hand clothing is now estimated to be worth between 2 and 4 million US dollars a year. So this is an enormous trade which is adding significant value to the global economy. Within Kenya itself, Kenya imported around 184,000 tons of second-hand clothing in recent years, and this has represented a 39% increase from around 5 or 6 years ago. So the scale of the trade has increased significantly, and it also has beneficial impacts for the economy. So we know that one of the most important features of the second-hand clothing trade, as Teresia pointed out at the beginning of the session, is that this industry is a job creation engine. It is creating many jobs throughout the supply chain, not just jobs in terms of jobs in the second-hand clothing trade directly, but also in related industries, in warehouse operations, in administration, in human resources, and so on. So this industry is also helping to provide livelihoods for many millions of people. We also know that across the East African community, this is a trade which is generating significant revenues for government. The tax and duties that's paid on the importation of second-hand clothing is itself contributing revenues to government, which then enables government to fund public services and infrastructure. But of course, we also know that there have been concerns expressed about the second-hand clothing trade, both in Kenya as well as in other countries in East Africa and more broadly. And I want in the presentation to be very upfront about what these concerns are. So the first concern, which is really centrally addressed in this research, is the claim that the importation of second-hand clothing is leading to an increase in dumping in landfill sites, as well as incineration, which is causing environmental damage. And we very specifically examine these claims in this research. It is also argued, though, that the second-hand clothing trade has a detrimental impact on the domestic manufacturing sector. If we have a stronger second-hand clothing trade, so it is argued, this will weaken domestic textile manufacturing. And the third claim, which is sometimes made, is that second-hand clothing is in some sense a health and safety hazard, that clothes can be contaminated when they come into countries, and this in itself presents health and safety risks for citizens. And these concerns have been taken seriously in some quarters of government. It is the case that in Kenya, several years ago, a second-hand clothing import prohibition was introduced, and we've seen other East African countries introduce similar bans. However, as we argue in this report, many of the claims on which these bans are predicated do not necessarily withstand scrutiny and evidence, and may also have in themselves harmful and damaging effects both on the economies and environments of the countries with which we're concerned. So to turn to the literature and the report specifically, this report is specifically designed to examine the environmental impact of the second-hand clothing sector. And as we heard in the previous presentation, I won't repeat the points at any length, but the research is robustly evidence-based. It's grounded in an extensive review of the literature. It interviews with policy stakeholders and industry stakeholders, as well as households, and also in a great deal of quantitative data analysis, as well as the qualitative research which has been done. The research has a number of objectives. 3 of them are very specific: to estimate the proportion of imported second-hand clothing which is disposed of as waste, to estimate the proportion of textile waste in the household waste of Nairobi, and then to estimate the proportion of textile waste which is deposited at a specific waste site in Nairobi. Those are the 3 specific objectives. We also have 2 further, more general objectives. One is to analyse the environmental impact of the trade versus the manufacturing of new clothes. And then finally, to demonstrate the economic, social, and environmental impact of the second-hand clothing industry, and how this in particular can underpin the development of what we call the circular economy, which is a way of trying to reconcile environmental and economic objectives, generating more wealth, but in a way which is environmentally sustainable. So the key findings of our research are that, firstly, the proportion of waste of imported second-hand clothing into Kenya is low. We estimate this proportion of waste to be less than 2%. And when you stand back and look at why this is the case, I think the reasons are fairly obvious. One is that second-hand clothing has to meet very high quality standards, and the industry is supported by a very high-skill sorting centre infrastructure. Before the clothes come into Kenya, they are sorted and processed and cleaned at very well-managed sorting centres, which in itself helps to reduce and manage waste. There is also a very effective and elaborate quality control and inspection system within Kenya itself, operated by the government of Kenya, which helps to ensure high levels of compliance and again reinforces low levels of waste. The key point to make is that this whole industry, which is a global industry, is predicated on minimizing waste, because in order for the industry to be competitive and for revenues to be maintained, you have to minimize the amount of waste which is being transported in clothing bundles. And this is precisely what the sorting center infrastructure is designed to do. We also find in our research that levels of textile waste at the Dandora site in Nairobi are very low, estimated at 1.89%, and that less than 0.5% of all household waste generated is actually coming from textiles. Again, this reflects the fact that the second-hand clothing trade is helping to support an infrastructure which is about repairing, recycling, upcycling and downcycling clothes and textile waste so as to minimize the amount of waste which is being generated and to reduce the carbon emissions associated with new production. So this is an industry that is having a very beneficial global environmental impact. We know that around the world each year, the second-hand clothing industry is leading to a significant reduction in overall levels of textile waste. It's leading to big reductions in CO2 emissions. It's leading to a big reduction in water consumption and to the use of pesticides. And it's also dramatically reducing the amount of plastic which is released into the ocean. So the environmental benefits are really multidimensional. What this industry is also doing is supporting development of what we call the circular economy. And this is an economy which marries together the objectives of wealth production and also sustainability. What the circular economy enables us to do is, rather than treating resources as infinite, if we treat resources as scarce, then we can think very differently about how to use them in ways that both help the environment, but also generate more jobs, particularly green jobs, in countries such as Kenya. This is a model of production which is leading to systems of textile use that are much more environmentally sustainable, but which are also creating more jobs, more wealth, more GDP growth, and so on. So what I want to just conclude by saying is that in order for governments around the world, and indeed also in East Africa, to realise the potential of the second-hand clothing trade, they need to have a supportive policy framework. Obviously, that means not banning the importation of second-hand clothing, which we argue would be counterproductive, but it also requires positive measures. It requires an industrial policy such as Kenya's Vision 2030 to really support this trade. It requires reductions in taxes and duties so as to further incentivize the importation of second-hand clothing. We need more sorting centers in the East African countries, which of course will help to create more jobs. We need to modernize infrastructure so that the industry can become more productive and efficient, invest in skills so that we further reduce waste levels and also improve the experience for the consumer. But we also need to invest in domestic waste management systems. We do not argue in this report that waste management is not an issue for countries like Kenya. Clearly it is, and it requires action by governments to change consumer and industry behavior, as well as putting in place a high-quality infrastructure that can improve waste management in the future. So in conclusion, this is a trade that's contributing massively to the development of the circular economy. This is a new way of thinking about sustainable economic development, which is being taken seriously by policymakers all over the world. We know that in this context, the second-hand clothing industry is having an enormous positive impact. It's reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's minimizing the generation of waste. It's cutting pollution. It's improving the quality, life of clothing, and it's also leading to the creation of many more green jobs and employment opportunities. So we argue in the report that the second-hand clothing trade and domestic textile manufacturers should seek to work together to advance innovation and further reduce environmental harm. But to do this, the second-hand clothing industry needs not import bans or prohibitions. What it needs is a supportive policy framework that can ensure that this industry can contribute even more in the future. And I want to just end with a quote from the President of Kenya, which just underlines the commitment the country has made to reducing polluting industrialization and creating a form of growth which is about creating more opportunities and jobs, but which is also about meeting our responsibilities to the environment and to reducing climate change and the transition towards net zero. And I, as I argue in this presentation, believe the second-hand clothing trade can make an enormous contribution to this objective. I will leave it there, Chair. Thank you so much for the time. And of course, I'd be delighted to take any questions or queries anybody has.
Thank you, Prof. And as a way of a closing remark, Teresia,
Yes.
how would you respond to this, and especially all those concerns that have been raised by various people across the globe?
Yes, I would want to say that fast fashion industry continues. As you know, Kenya is one of the best, Kenyans are one of the best dressed people globally. And let's talk about revival of textile in Kenya. About 20 years ago, textile industry began going down. It was not as a result of used clothes. It had other things and other issues. And today, as I close, I want to say this. What we need is to revive our cotton industry in Kenya. And reviving our cotton industry in Kenya does not mean that we do away with our used clothes importation. Used clothes and textile industry, they can coexist. We can grow our cotton, we can revive our ginneries, we can start production, we can even bring in we can also train our youth into becoming fundis to start making clothes. And all that can be done, and it will be good for our country. But that does not mean we undermine the position of Mitumba trade. Mitumba trade and textile industry, they can coexist, they can outdo each other. Whichever outdoes the other one, they should be allowed to compete. They should be allowed to grow together. Our nation needs to revive the textile industry. And we as Mitumba traders, we are in support of a revival of textile industry. In fact, we also have our supply chain. If we can revive our cotton industry, Mitumba traders will also include it. I remember August 2020, we had a meeting with the former president, and he told us, as we sell our Mitumba, we can also introduce selling locally produced goods. And we were in agreement. In fact, we were in agreement, and we decided, we as Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya, if Kenya starts producing locally made goods, we will also consider putting them into our supply chain. Mitumba and new clothes. By new clothes and the textile, I mean something that is locally made, produced. Cotton grown in Kenya, ginnaries, materials made from our ginnaries, and then clothes that are made by our people. We can do that to promote our nation and want to see our country growing further and further. And as I finish, let me say this. As per now, we do not have our own textile. If today we decide to ban Mitumba and promote our local textile, that means we'll be promoting China. That means we'll be promoting India. That means we'll be promoting other countries that are able to export to us their materials. I would also want to recommend, if we want to think about reviving our own textile industries, we think of doing it all the way, growing cotton, reviving our ginnaries, and making locally clothes here. Thank you very, very much, and God bless you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Teresia, and thank you everybody who has joined us in this webinar this afternoon. And thank you to my panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the conclusion of today's discussion, allow me to thank our panelists, Teresia Wairimo, who's the chairperson of the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya, Tobias Odhiambo from the Information Research Solutions, the team that conducted this research, and Professor Patrick Diamond of Queen Mary University, London, who edited the report. This session was recorded and it will be shared with all of you alongside a copy of the report that we've launched this afternoon. The video and the report will also be uploaded on the Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya website. That is mitumbaassociation.org. I'll say again, mitumbaassociation.org. And if you'd like to stay in touch, you'd like to get more information, you'd like to maybe seek further questions and clarifications, you can do so by sending an email to mcak@mitumbaassociation.org. That's mcak@mitumbaassociation.org. The Mitumba Consortium Association of Kenya would like to sincerely thank you for joining us in this webinar, which we hope will be start of a greater consultation and collaboration with traders who work in this space going forward. And now, on behalf of everyone who worked to make this happen, I wish to thank you all and bid you goodbye. Asante sana. Kwaheri.